balancing the household accounts at 11:30 in the evening, with a single tallow candle guttering at her elbow and the footman long since retired, Cordelia Ashby did not hear the carriage arrive. She heard, instead, the third-floor window rattling in its casement, which meant the latch she had requested be repaired 6 weeks ago had still not been addressed, and she made a note of it in the margin of her ledger in the small, exact hand she had developed over 4 years of managing Amesworth Hall on behalf of a cousin who could not have told her the name of a single one of his tenants. The ballroom above her was still warm with the evening's entertainments. Lady Cassandra Vane had arranged the harvest assembly, 200 guests, 7 courses, dancing until midnight, and the achievement of it had required, as most achievements at Amesworth Hall required, Cordelia's invisible labor in every preceding hour. She had negotiated the price of the candles downward by 12 shillings. She had corrected the seating plan 3 times to prevent the Henshaw family from being placed adjacent to the Moorfields, between whom a property dispute had simmered for 2 seasons. She had sourced the string quartet from Dartbridge rather than London at a savings of £4, and she had done all of this without her name appearing in a single arrangement, a single bill of receipt, or a single word of Lady Cassandra's gracious thanks to her assembled guests. And at the edge of all that gilded excess, seated at a writing desk in the housekeeper's corridor, with a ledger open on her knee and a correction needed on line 47, was Cordelia. She wore gray wool. She always wore gray wool. It was practical, and it did not show ink. It was the sound of boots on the stone entrance that finally reached her, not the soft-footed approach of a late footman, but something deliberate, measured, unhurried, the kind of tread that belonged to a man who had never needed to apologize for his own arrival. Cordelia looked up from line 47 and listened. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. The name she heard, spoken by her cousin's butler in a tone he reserved for persons of genuine consequence, was the Duke of Ashford. Not the family name, simply Ashford, as though the dukedom itself were the only name required. She knew the name. Everyone in 3 counties knew the name. The Ashford estate bordered Amesworth to the north, and the late Duke had been a formidable neighbor, which meant the current Duke, who had inherited at 27 and had not, by most accounts, been seen at any social gathering in the 2 years since, was a quantity no one in this house had calculated for. Cordelia set down her pen. She straightened line 47 and closed the ledger. Then she pressed one hand briefly against the cool plaster wall beside her desk, and she stood. She did not go upstairs to look. She returned to her accounts because someone had to, and because the correction on line 47 was not going to make itself. But she noted the time, and she noted the arrival. With the same quiet precision she noted everything. She had been managing this house since she was 22 years old. She was now 26. 4 years of invisible labor had produced in her something she did not have a word for exactly. Not bitterness, which would have been a waste, and not contentment, which would have been a lie. Something more like the temper of a blade that has been worked long enough to hold its edge without being told to. She picked up her pen and continued. She had been born Cordelia Ashby, the youngest child of Edward Ashby, who had been a country solicitor of genuine intelligence and modest means, and who had died of a winter fever when Cordelia was 19, leaving behind 3,000 words of careful instruction in his will and not quite enough money to carry any of them out. Her mother had died when Cordelia was 12. There had been no brothers. There had been an aunt in Hertfordshire who had corresponded warmly for approximately 4 months after Edward Ashby's death, then corresponded less warmly, then not at all. The cousin, Miles Ashby, who held Amesworth Hall by inheritance through a branch of the family Cordelia had never met before she arrived at his door, had received her with the particular magnanimity of a man who expects to be thanked for tolerating a relative. He had offered her the use of a bedroom on the 3rd floor, a modest quarterly allowance of £15, and the position, undefined and unrecorded, of managing whatever required managing, so that he did not have to think about it. Cordelia had arrived with a trunk and a clear understanding of her position, and she had set immediately to work. The first thing she discovered was that Amesworth Hall was in a state of elegant decay. The accounts were 3 years behind. The tenant ledger was incomplete. 2 of the 3 farms were being worked by men who had not had their rent agreements reviewed in a decade, and were, in 2 cases, paying under the value of the land because no one had thought to renegotiate. The household staff had not received their full quarterly wages in 8 months. There were creditors, 3 of them, patient but not unlimited, who had been writing letters that Miles Ashby had been routing, unopened, into a drawer. Cordelia opened the drawer. She read the letters. She sat with them for one evening. Then she sat with the ledger for another evening. And on the 3rd evening, she drafted a response to each creditor, respectful, precise, proposing a structured repayment schedule that would require reducing household expenditure by 1/3 for 8 months. She presented this plan to her cousin, who had said, with genuine bewilderment, "However did you manage all that?" and then gone back to his newspaper. She had managed it because it required managing, and someone had to, and she was there. She renegotiated the tenant agreements the following spring, and the recovered margin was £400 annually, not a fortune, but the difference between a household that continued and one that did not. She supervised the repair of the east wing roof, which had been leaking through 2 winters. She established a household account system that the housekeeper, Mrs. Paris, learned to maintain between Cordelia's quarterly reviews. She drafted a new agreement with the wool merchant in Dartbridge, after discovering that the existing arrangement had not been updated since her cousin's father's time, and was returning a price per pound that was 14% below the current market rate. She did not receive a raise in her allowance. She did not receive a title or a role. She received, in the 4th year, a clause. She was not certain, later, how clearly Miles Ashby had understood what he was signing when he engaged his family solicitor to draw up the household management agreement, a document she had, in fact, requested herself, believing that any formal record of her role was better than none. The solicitor had been an elderly man from Dartbridge who had misread her meaning in one particular item, and Miles Ashby had signed without reading closely, and Cordelia had received her copy 3 days later and found, on page 4, a clause that had not been discussed. It bound her to the role of household manager at Amesworth Hall until such time as the arrangement was dissolved by mutual consent of both parties. Mutual consent, both parties. Miles Ashby, who thought the arrangement extremely convenient, had no intention of dissolving it. The clause was, in effect, a lock. She had read it 4 times. She had read it again in the morning. She had sat with it for a week, turning it over as one turns a stone to see what lives beneath it. And at the end of the week, she had returned to work because the east wing roof was showing signs of needing attention again, and the tenant in the southernmost farm had written to say his drainage ditch had collapsed. She was not going to step aside from what she had built, and she was not going to break. But she needed a way out of the clause, and she had not found one yet. That was the condition in which she had been living when the Duke of Ashford arrived. The condition the Duke of Ashford was in, though no one at Amesworth Hall, and very few people anywhere, were permitted to know it, was this. The Ashford estate had been run without proper accounts management for the same 2 years in which he had been its sole administrator. His steward, a man of 30 years' service to the previous duke, had died in the spring. The replacement steward had lasted 4 months before the scope of the work and the silence of the new duke had combined to drive him back to wherever he had come from. The estate was not in ruin. Ashford was a disciplined man, and he had kept the essential machinery moving by force of will and the kind of relentless attention that leaves a person very quiet at social gatherings. But it was becoming clear to him, in the way that certain structural problems become clear, that what he needed was not another steward. He needed someone who had actually done the work. His secretary, a methodical man named Oliver Graves, had been compiling information on the matter for 3 months, and had presented him, in September, with a summary that included, at the bottom of the 2nd page, a note about Amesworth Hall. The hall was modest. It was not, by any objective measure, a well-run estate, but the financial records that had been lodged with the Dartbridge Mercantile Society over the past 4 years told a story of progressive, deliberate improvement. The tenant rents had been renegotiated. The creditor accounts were cleared. The household expenditure had been reduced, and then carefully rebuilt. The wool contract had been renegotiated at a figure that Graves noted, with evident respect, was a full 17% above the previous arrangement. The records were lodged, as required by the Mercantile Society, under the name of the managing party. The name was Cordelia Ashby. Ashford had read the report twice. He had then asked Graves to discover what he could about the individual. The information that came back was thin, in the way information about overlooked persons always is. She was a dependent relation, unmarried, no independent income, attached to the household in an informal capacity. There was a mention of a management agreement, but no details of its terms. He had attended the harvest assembly at Ainsworth Hall, not because he had been inclined toward social gatherings. He had not attended a social gathering in 2 years, and the invitation had sat on his desk for 11 days before he had opened it, but because it seemed the most direct way to see what he could not otherwise read. He did not find her in the ballroom. He found her cousin, who was a well-presented man of 40, with the hands of someone who had never repaired anything, and Lady Cassandra Vane, who was extraordinarily beautiful and who moved through the room as though it had been constructed for that purpose. Lady Cassandra had greeted Ashford with the practiced warmth of a woman who understands exactly the value of a ducal title, and she had spent 20 minutes demonstrating that she understood the running of this household as the management of appearances, and appearances alone. Ashford had extracted himself, politely, and had walked the length of the upper floor, and had then descended a secondary staircase that a footman directed him toward, when he expressed a wish for quiet, and had found himself in a corridor, lit by a single candle at a writing desk. He had stopped, he had looked. The woman at the desk was small and precise-featured, with dark hair pinned without ornament and gray wool that had seen more than one winter. She was writing in a hand so controlled it was nearly mechanical, and she had not looked up at his arrival. "The latch on the third-floor window," she said, without raising her eyes, "has been on the repair list since October. I mention it only because that is the direction from which you came, and if it rattled when you passed it, the fault is the carpenter's, not the weather." Ashford regarded her for a moment. She continued writing. "You are Cordelia Ashby," he said. It was not a question. "I am." She did look up then, not startled, not flattered. She looked at him with the particular stillness of someone measuring the distance between what a thing appears to be and what it actually is. "And you are the Duke of Ashford. You have arrived without prior correspondence. I assume you have your reasons." He said, "I have been reading your accounts." She set down her pen. He noted that she did not react with surprise or modesty. She waited. "The Mercantile Society records," he said. 4 years of them. "They are accurate," she said. "I know," he said. "That is why I am here." He had not intended to say it so directly. He was not, as a general rule, a direct man. He was a careful man, and there was a difference. But something about the quality of her attention, the absence of performance in it, had produced directness, the way a level surface produces a straight line. He did not say what he was about to ask, not that night, not in the corridor. He said, instead, "I wonder if you would permit me to call, formally, in the coming week." She regarded him for another moment, then she said, "I cannot speak for my cousin's calendar." "I was not," he said, "asking for your cousin." She held that for a beat, then she picked up her pen. "Thursday," she said, "at 10. He was already preparing to leave before she had returned her gaze to the ledger, but he did not miss the way she straightened her spine as he withdrew. Not from relief or excitement, but from the posture of a woman reordering her attention and returning it to the work in front of her. He had stood in the corridor for 2 additional minutes after she had clearly dismissed him, listening to the scratch of her pen. He came back on Thursday at 10. He was shown, by a footman who had received no particular instruction regarding his arrival, to the morning room, where he waited 11 minutes before Cordelia appeared, with a set of household journals under her arm and a directness in her expression that was not discourtesy, but was very clearly not social performance either. She set the journals on the table between them and sat without waiting for him to arrange her chair. "You have seen the Mercantile Society records," she said. "What is it, specifically, that you are looking for?" He told her. He told her plainly, which was something he had not managed in the 47 days since his last steward had departed, because plainness requires a listener who does not require protection from honesty, and most listeners require exactly that. The Ashford estate was structurally sound, but operationally unmoored. He had a household of 23 staff and 112 tenant acres, and a wool income that had been static for 6 years. He had no steward. He had been managing every decision himself, and the decisions were multiplying. She listened without interrupting. She asked 4 questions, each of them specific and practical, and the 4th one, regarding the terms of his existing wool contract, made him stop. "I do not know the exact figure per pound," he said. "Then that," she said, is the first thing you need to find out. Bring it on Friday." He did not say, "I am a duke, and I do not take instruction from household managers." He said, "Friday." He did not come on Friday, empty-handed. He brought the wool contract and his household expenditure summary for the past 18 months, and his steward's final notes, and she spread them across the morning room table with the focused attention of a woman who has been waiting all her life for a problem of appropriate size. She found the discrepancy in the wool contract in 14 minutes. It was not dramatic. It was a clause regarding dockage weight that had been included in the original agreement and never reviewed, and it was costing the Ashford estate approximately £60 annually in unnecessary deductions. £60, not a fortune, but the kind of number that, added to a dozen other numbers like it, becomes the difference between an estate that grows and one that quietly subsides. She circled it in pencil and showed him without comment. He looked at the circle. He looked at her. "How long has that been there?" he asked. "I cannot say without seeing the original agreement, at least the length of the current contract, which appears to be 6 years." He did not say anything else for a moment. He simply took the contract from the table, folded it with care, and placed it in his coat. He came back the following Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. By the third Wednesday, the arrangement had a shape, though it had not yet been named. Lady Cassandra Vane noticed. Lady Cassandra noticed everything that concerned her interests, and the Duke of Ashford calling formally at Amesworth Hall on 4 consecutive occasions was a thing that concerned her interests considerably. She had been understood by everyone in her social circle, and by Miles Ashby most particularly, to be the natural and elegant solution to the question of who the Duke of Ashford would eventually marry. She was beautifully presented, impeccably connected, and had managed the appearance of Amesworth Hall for 3 seasons, with the particular competence that applied to appearances specifically. She appeared in the morning room on the 4th Wednesday without invitation. She brought with her a tray of refreshments that had not been requested, a gown the color of winter roses, and a smile she had been practicing, Cordelia suspected, since approximately the age of 14. "Your Grace," she said, with a warmth that was precisely calibrated, "I hope you will excuse me for joining you. I did so want to speak with you about the neighborhood's plans for the winter assemblies." She settled herself in the chair nearest Ashford, with the ease of a woman who has never had reason to doubt her welcome. "We have been quite abandoned for entertainments of late," Ashford said. "I had not realized you were aware of our meeting." "Oh, I make it my business to be aware of everything under this roof," Cassandra said, with a laugh that was entirely pleasant and not at all directed at Cordelia, who was seated at the opposite end of the table, with the Ashford household expenditure summary open in front of her. Cordelia did not look up. "Miss Vane," she said, "the refreshments tray has been placed over the heating vent, and the tea will be undrinkable in 4 minutes. You may wish to attend to that." It was the most precisely targeted sentence she had delivered in recent memory, and it worked. Cassandra turned to look at the tray, found herself uncertain about the heating vent, and was briefly and completely distracted from the room's dynamic, while Cordelia closed the expenditure summary, made a note on her separate page, and then looked at Ashford directly. "There is an additional issue in the tenant accounts," she said. "The Merton Farm, line 63. The rent record shows a payment made in June that does not appear in the household receipt book. I would like to know who received it before I draw any conclusions." Ashford said, "I will find out." Cassandra, regrouping, said brightly, "How very industrious you are, Miss Ashby." The word industrious landed in the room the way a wrongly placed piece of furniture lands. It simply did not belong in the arrangement it had been placed in. Cordelia looked at Cassandra without heat. "The Merton Farm payment," she said to Ashford, as though Cassandra had not spoken, "amounts to £14. If it was received and not recorded, the discrepancy will need to be addressed before the quarter closes, or the tenant account will show an error that could affect the lease renewal. I would have the answer by Monday if possible." Ashford said, "By Monday." Cassandra set down her teacup and recognized, with the strategic intelligence she genuinely possessed, that she had not won this particular exchange. She departed with grace, because she was very good at grace, and she did not say another word against Cordelia directly. She did not need to. She spent the following week making careful mention, in drawing rooms across the county, of the peculiar situation at Amesworth Hall, where a duke of some consequence appeared to be spending his Wednesday mornings in private conference with an unpaid relation of the household. The mention was always phrased with the particular warmth of genuine concern. Cordelia heard about it from Eleanor Braxton, who arrived at Amesworth Hall on a Saturday in October with the straightforward speed of a woman who has heard something that requires immediate confirmation. Eleanor Braxton was the daughter of a retired diplomat of some standing, and she had known Cordelia since they were girls at the same dame school in Dartbridge, and she had the rare quality of seeing what was in front of her with accuracy. She sat across from Cordelia in the small parlor, the comfortable one, not the formal one, and said, without preliminary, "Cassandra Vane has told everyone in the county that you have trapped the Duke of Ashford into some kind of professional arrangement that he cannot gracefully escape." Cordelia poured the tea. "Cassandra Vane should attend to her own arrangements," she said, "which are, by the way, somewhat less organized than she presents them." "Cordelia," Eleanor leaned forward, "is it true? Is he coming to you specifically?" "He is coming to review the Amesworth accounts as a reference point for his own estate management. It is entirely professional." Eleanor looked at her with the particular expression of a friend who is not deceived. "He has been here 4 Wednesdays. 5, as of this week. And the Merton payment?" Cordelia looked at her. "How do you know about the Merton payment?" "I don't," Eleanor said. "I just wanted to see if you'd tell me." Cordelia set down the teapot. She allowed herself, briefly, the specific amusement that Eleanor Braxton always produced in her. "It has been resolved," she said. "The payment was received by the previous steward and improperly routed. No fault on the tenant's part. Ashford dealt with it cleanly." "Ashford," Eleanor repeated, without the title. Cordelia reached for her own cup and said nothing. Eleanor said, quietly, "You are being seen, Cordelia. I hope you know that." She had been seen, before this, once. Her father, Edward Ashby, had understood entirely what she was, and what she was capable of, and he had said so, clearly and often, in the specific vocabulary of a solicitor who had trained in precision of expression. "You have an orderly mind and a steady will," he had said to her when she was 17 and had corrected a mistake in his account that he had not caught himself. "And these things will serve you when nothing else will." He had meant it as preparation, as provision, of a kind. She had carried it for 9 years, as though it were exactly that. Being seen by the Duke of Ashford was not the same as being seen by her father, but it was closer to the same quality of attention than anything she had encountered in the intervening years, and she was, as a woman who counted carefully, aware of the difference. He arrived on the 6th Wednesday with the wool contract renegotiation drafted by his London solicitor, and he laid it open on the table and turned it to face her without speaking. She read it. She read it all the way through, and on the 3rd page she found the clause she had expected to find, the one that replicated the existing dockage weight provision in different language. "This does not correct the problem," she said. "It reiterates it in more formal terms. The dockage weight clause needs to be removed entirely, not restated." He read the clause she indicated. He read it twice. Then he said, "My solicitor drafted this." "Your solicitor is not a wool merchant," she said, "and he has presumably not read the Dartbridge market reports for the past 3 years, which would tell him that the current standard dockage rate is 1% below what this clause implies is normal practice. If you sign this, you will continue to lose approximately £60 annually, adjusted upward as your volume grows." He was quiet for a moment. "And if I have it redrafted, then you would need to strike Clause 7 and replace it with a provision specifying the standard dockage rate as fixed at the Dartbridge Exchange average, with annual review. I can write the language if that would be useful." He looked at her. Not measuring this time. He had completed his measuring some weeks ago and moved on to something she did not quite have a word for, something with more attention in it. "Yes," he said. "Write the language." She wrote it. She wrote it in the small, exact hand, and she handed it across the table, and he read it without looking up for a considerable time. "How did you learn to do this?" he said. "My father was a solicitor," she said. "He taught me to read a contract before I could manage long division." He set the paper down. He said, with a quietness she had begun to recognize as a form of his most direct expression, "He saw what you were." She did not respond immediately. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the table, not visibly, just the lightest pressure, and then she said, "He did." It was on that Wednesday that she first noticed his cravat was crooked. Not enormously, but enough that she wondered how long it had been so. and she spent the remainder of the meeting aware of it in the way one is aware of a note played in the wrong key. He was leaving when she said, "Your cravat has been crooked since you arrived. I mention it only because you appear to have a meeting after this, and it will be remarked upon." He stopped. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not quite surprise, since he was not a man who allowed surprise in, but something adjacent to it, something like the recognition of a room that has been entered for the first time and found unexpectedly furnished. He straightened the cravat himself. He said, 40 minutes? Closer to 50. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, without particular emphasis, "I will see you Wednesday." She returned to the table and picked up her pen. Amesworth Hall had a housekeeper named Mrs. Dunmore, who was 63 years old and had been in the household since before Miles Ashby had inherited it, and who had taken an exact and comprehensive measure of Cordelia from the day of her arrival. Mrs. Dunmore did not praise easily, and she did not offer warmth for social purposes. But she had arrived in Cordelia's writing room one evening in early November with a cup of tea that had not been requested and a plate of biscuits from the kitchen, and she had set them both down without comment and withdrawn. It was the warmest welcome Cordelia had received at Amesworth Hall, and she had accepted it as it was given, without ceremony and with genuine gratitude. Mrs. Dunmore also, in the particular way of housekeepers who understand the household better than anyone else in it, knew about the clause. She had read it the same week Cordelia received it, because Cordelia had left it on the desk, and Mrs. Dunmore had read everything on that desk as a professional obligation, and she had said nothing about it for 7 months, until one evening in November, when she set a second cup of tea on the desk, a second cup, which was not usual, and said, "The solicitor who drafted that agreement is old Harwick in Dartbridge." "Yes," Cordelia said. "Harwick made the same error in the Penrith housekeeping agreement in 1808, Mrs. Dunmore said. It was corrected by a rider attached to the original document, witnessed by both parties, and accepted by the Mercantile Society's registry as a valid amendment." Cordelia looked up. "I mention it," Mrs. Dunmore said, picking up her own cup as though the conversation had been entirely unremarkable, "because riders do not require both parties to originate them, only to witness them. If one party drafts the correction and the other signs it, the mutual consent requirement can be satisfied in a single meeting." She drank her tea. Cordelia sat with that for a long moment. "I would need Miles to agree to sign it," she said. "You have been managing this house for 4 years," Mrs. Dunmore said. "You have been managing your cousin for approximately the same period. I suspect you know how to arrange for the right piece of paper to appear in front of him at the right moment." Cordelia looked at the ledger in front of her, and then she looked at Mrs. Dunmore, and something in her chest that had been held at a particular angle for the better part of a year shifted, very slightly, and steadied. "I will need to draft the rider carefully," she said. "I imagine you will," said Mrs. Dunmore, and finished her tea. The rider took her 11 days to draft, and then 3 more to revise, because she wanted the language to be so unambiguous that no future reader could find room for a different interpretation. She modeled the structure on the Penrith Amendment Mrs. Dunmore had described, and she added a clause specifying that upon dissolution, the managing party would retain all records, accounts, and correspondence pertaining to her role that she had herself generated, which was most of them. She drafted it, and then she set it aside, because she did not yet need it, and she was a woman who did not waste her instruments before the moment required them. She needed to be certain, first, of what she was drafting it for. The conversation with Ashford she had been not quite having for 3 weeks, arrived finally on a Wednesday in late November, when the first frost had come and the morning room was cold enough that she had lit the fire before his arrival, and he had appeared in the doorway and looked at the fire and then at her, and she had simply returned to the table and said, "I have been thinking about the Merton tenancy." He came to the table, he sat, but he did not open the papers he had brought. He said, "I would like to speak with you about something that is not the Merton tenancy." She was quiet. He said, "I came to Amesworth in September because your accounts were the most coherent thing I had read in 2 years. That is not a small thing to say. I have been reading accounts since I was 17 years old." He paused. "My mother managed the Ashford estate from the time I was 12 until her death, and she was the most capable administrator in 3 counties, and no one outside the estate ever knew it. I knew it. I knew what that quality looked like. I had not seen it again until I read your records. Cordelia listened. She did not move. I would like, he said, to make you a formal offer, not of employment. I have given this considerable thought. I would like to ask whether you would consider a proposal of marriage. The room was warm and still. Cordelia looked at the table. She looked at the fire. She pressed both palms flat against the surface of the table, feeling the solidity of the wood, and she thought about it completely, the way she thought about everything that required a careful answer, from all sides, in full light, without the distortions of urgency or hope. She said, I am bound by a contractual clause to Amesworth Hall that would require resolution before I could make any change to my position. I know, he said. I read the Mercantile Society registry this week. I had Graves find the agreement. She looked at him. The Ryder approach, he said, is legally sound. I have had my solicitor confirm it. If you have drafted the language, I would be glad to have it reviewed. She regarded him for a moment with the particular stillness of someone who has been working alone for a long time and has just discovered that the room next door is not empty. You had your solicitor review a rider to a contract that is not your contract, she said. I had my solicitor review any legal obstacle between your current position and the one I am proposing, he said, with the evenness of a man who has thought this through and is not ashamed of having thought it. That is not the same thing. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, I will give you my answer on Friday. He did not press. He simply stood and gathered his papers and said, Friday. He was gone before she realized that she had not said no, and that she had been aware of not saying no, and that this was itself a kind of answer. The rider was witnessed by Miles Ashby on a Thursday morning with a punctuality that surprised everyone, including Miles Ashby, who had been presented by Cordelia with the document over breakfast and had read, as she had calculated, only far enough to understand that she was asking to be released from an administrative obligation, and had signed it with the generous air of a man doing a favor, and had then returned to his kipper. Eleanor Braxton, who had arrived at Amesworth Hall that same morning for reasons she described as a social call and were clearly nothing of the kind, witnessed the signing. You are extraordinary, Eleanor told her afterward in the small parlor. I am practical, Cordelia said. The rider was legally straightforward. The timing was simply a matter of having the right instrument ready. Eleanor looked at her with the expression she reserved for moments when Cordelia was deliberately understating something. He arranged for his solicitor to review it. So he told me. Cordelia. Eleanor leaned forward. A duke arranged legal research to dissolve a contractual obligation that stood between you and his proposal, while you were simultaneously drafting the resolution from your end, independently, because you had already decided what your answer was going to be before you admitted it to yourself. Cordelia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I will tell you on Friday. Eleanor made a sound that was somewhere between exasperation and delight, and ate a biscuit. The formal public occasion at which the matter became undeniable was the Dartbridge Charitable Society's Winter Assembly, held in the second week of December in the Assembly Rooms, which were the grandest in the county, and which had been arranged, at considerable organizational effort, by a committee of which Lady Cassandra Vane was the chair. 240 guests, 12 sponsors of note. The Duke of Ashford, whose attendance was considered the social achievement of the season, had confirmed his presence 3 weeks prior. What had not been arranged, or anticipated, was the matter of the Amesworth accounts. In the third week of November, a letter had arrived at Amesworth Hall from a Mr. Farley, representing a consortium of 3 investors who had extended a bridging loan to Miles Ashby's father 11 years prior, and who had, through what they described as a clerical oversight, never received the full acknowledgement of repayment that had in fact been made, paid off entirely, as Cordelia's records showed clearly, in 1818. The letter requested settlement of the outstanding amount, which Farley and his consortium had been describing, in correspondence with several parties of social consequence, as an unpaid obligation of the Amesworth estate. It was not unpaid. Cordelia had the receipt. She had the cross-referenced ledger entry. She had, in fact, 3 separate documentary records of the transaction, because she kept records the way some people keep breath, continuously, from habit, because the alternative was to not have them. She had written to Farley directly, crisply, with copies of the relevant documentation attached, and Farley had written back disputing the document's authenticity. He had then, through channels Cordelia found both transparent and irritating, arranged for the dispute to become a matter of social discussion, in time for the winter assembly. It was, she understood, an attempt to make the Amesworth name appear disreputable through the assembly season, when the damage would spread most efficiently. What Farley had not accounted for was that the Duke of Ashford would hear of it before the assembly, through Oliver Graves, who heard a great many things. Ashford had sent a note to Cordelia on the Monday of the assembly week. It contained 6 words: "Bring the documentation. I will be there." Cordelia brought the documentation. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. Cordelia had been keeping rooms standing for 4 years, and she walked into the Dartbridge assembly rooms on that December evening in her second-best gown, the dark blue one, which was better than the gray wool if not quite equal to winter roses, with a leather portfolio under her arm and the particular calm of a woman who has verified her position from every angle and found it sound. She found Eleanor immediately. Eleanor was wearing green and was already watching the room. "Farley is here," Eleanor said quietly, "with Sir Edmund Holt, who chairs the Mercantile Society's Disputes Committee. I believe Farley intends to make a scene." "He is welcome to," Cordelia said. "Cordelia, I have 11 years of records, Eleanor. He has a claim, with no supporting document." Eleanor looked at her portfolio. She looked at Cordelia's expression. Then she stepped back, slightly, and said, "All right." Sir Edmund Holt was a man of 62, with the measured bearing of someone who has spent his career determining which party in a dispute has the stronger documentation, and who has found, over that career, that parties who arrive at these moments with leather portfolios tend to have it. He found Cordelia 30 minutes into the assembly, in a deliberate passage across the floor that she recognized as intentional. "Miss Ashby," he said, "I understand there is a matter of record pertaining to the Amesworth estate that has been raised by Mr. Farley." "There is," she said, "a matter in which Mr. Farley has made a claim that is contradicted by 11 years of verified documentation. I have brought the records." "In the assembly rooms," Sir Edmund said, with the careful tone of a man aware of his audience. "Mr. Farley raised the claim in the assembly rooms," she said. "I am simply prepared to answer it in the same location." Sir Edmund Holt looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Very well," he said, "if you will give me a moment to gather the relevant parties." Farley came forward when summoned with the confidence of a man who has been telling his version of the story for long enough that he has begun to believe it completely. He was a broad man, well-dressed, with the reddened complexion of someone accustomed to his own authority. "Miss Ashby," he said, with a dismissiveness that was entirely unsubtle, "I wonder if this is really the appropriate moment for—" "The receipt of repayment," Cordelia said, opening the portfolio, "is dated April 14th, 1818, and bears the signature of your principal's agent, a Mr. Thomas Griggs, whose signature appears also on the original loan agreement, which I have here as the second document." She placed both on the side table that a footman had materialized from somewhere to her right. The third document is the Amesworth household ledger entry for April 1818, which records the transaction in the ordinary course of accounts with a cross-reference to the receipt. She placed that. The fourth document is a letter from the Dartbridge Mercantile Society's registry, confirming that the loan agreement was marked as satisfied in their records in May 1818. She placed the fourth document. The room had gathered. It had not erupted. Not erupted. There was a long, suspended moment in which 230 people, who had been performing the social rituals of a December assembly, became, without quite deciding to, an audience. Farley looked at the 4 documents. He picked up the first one. He read it. His complexion, which had been a confident red, moved towards something less decided. "These could be," he started. "Mr. Farley," Sir Edmund said, with the quiet authority of a man who has been in this business for 40 years and knows exactly what he is looking at. "I have reviewed documents from the Amesworth estate before. The hand is consistent with the records held in the Mercantile Society registry. The cross-referencing is," he paused, examining the ledger page with genuine attention, meticulous. Ashford arrived beside Cordelia at that moment, not from across the room, but from directly adjacent, which meant he had been close for some time, and she had not registered it, which was unlike her, and she noted it. He did not speak. He stood at her left, in the dark coat she had come to recognize as his, and he looked at the documents and then at Sir Edmund, and the room felt his presence shift the weight of the situation, in the way a well-built bridge shifts when a load is properly placed. "Your Grace," Sir Edmund said. "Sir Edmund," a pause. "I believe Miss Ashby has answered the claim in full." Sir Edmund said, "She has." Farley set the receipt back on the table with the careful gesture of a man who is admitting defeat without saying so. He looked at Cordelia, he said, with a stiffness that was not quite dignity, but was the nearest he could manage. "The claim will be withdrawn." "It was never valid," Cordelia said, without heat. "I would be grateful if that point were communicated as clearly as the claim was." Sir Edmund said that it would be. Lady Cassandra Vane had watched the entire proceeding from a position 15 feet to the right, and her expression as it concluded was complex. Not malice, not contempt, but the particular recalibration of a woman who has just seen something she cannot unsee. She did not approach Cordelia. She turned, gracefully, and engaged the person nearest to her in conversation, and that was, in its own way, as complete an acknowledgement as anything else that had occurred that evening. Miles Ashby, who had been present for approximately the last 90 seconds of the proceeding, said to Cordelia afterward, with his characteristic bewilderment, "However did you manage to have all that ready?" "I keep records," she said. "I have always kept records." It was afterward, when the assembly had reconstituted itself with the particular energy of a room that has witnessed something and is now processing it through every available social channel, that Ashford found her at the edge of the floor. He said quietly, "You have been keeping those records for 11 years. Since I arrived," she said, "the loan predated my tenure, but the receipt was in the drawer with the creditor letters." "The drawer," he said. "He kept everything unopened," she said. "I opened it." He held that for a moment. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "For what?" "For not making the offer sooner," he said. "You have been managing this, all of this, and I have been conducting Wednesday reviews as though that were sufficient." Cordelia regarded him with the particular directness she reserved for things that required it. "It was sufficient," she said. "The timing was the right timing. I needed the rider resolved first. You had the rider drafted before I made the offer." "I had it drafted before I was certain of my answer," she said. The preparation and the decision were not the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the specific deliberateness of a man acting in full knowledge of his audience, he took her hand. He was wearing gloves. She was wearing gloves. The contact was formal and entirely visible, and he raised her hand and held it, and the room, which had been watching already, understood exactly what it was seeing. "Miss Ashby," he said, with a quietness that was not for the room but was audible throughout it, "I will ask you again properly, not here." "I know," she said. "Will you give me the opportunity?" She held his gaze. Then she said in the same even tone, "Yes." The room did not erupt. The room settled, shifted, the way a well-built structure settles after a load is properly seated. Sir Edmund Holt, who had not moved far, watched with the expression of a man who is noting something for his own records. Eleanor Braxton, from across the floor, looked at Cordelia with a brightness she did not attempt to contain. And Lord Basil Hargreave, the Duke of Ashford's father's oldest surviving advisor, and the man who had written to Ashford twice in the past month, expressing his grave reservations about the apparent direction of these Wednesday meetings, stood near the far doorway and looked at Cordelia Ashby with the documents still spread on the side table, and the Duke of Ashford still holding her hand, and he said nothing at all for a considerable time. He found Cordelia half an hour later, when the assembly had moved on to its next preoccupation, and she was retrieving her portfolio from the table. "Miss Ashby," he said, "I confess, I came tonight expecting to form one conclusion. I appear to have formed another." She looked at him. He was a tall man, formal in his bearing, with the measured expression of someone who has spent his life applying consistent standards to inconsistent circumstances. "The records are what they are," she said. "They are," he said. "And so are you, it appears." He paused. There was nothing warm in the pause, but nothing contemptuous either. It was the pause of a man doing the work of revising, which is harder than first forming. "The Duke of Ashford," he said carefully, "makes his own decisions. He has always made his own decisions. I have not always understood them immediately." He offered a small, precise bow. He withdrew. It was, Cordelia understood, the nearest she would receive to acknowledgement from that quarter, and it was more than she had expected, and she placed it where she placed things she had earned, quietly, without ceremony, exactly where it belonged. The proper occasion arrived on a Sunday evening in January, in the Ashford Library, which she had come to know, over the course of many Wednesday visits, as the room that held the most honest version of him. The books, with their broken spines, that had been actually read. The desk, with its organized disorder. The chair at the window, where the light was best, and where she had once sat for 20 minutes reviewing a contract, while he stood at the bookcase nearby, and they had both worked in silence, in the particular ease of two people who have become each other's necessary company, without quite deciding to. She had come to see the library's revised estate plan, which was a reasonable pretext that neither of them had pretended was the only reason for the visit. He had set the estate plan on the desk. He had not moved toward it. He said, "I want to say this correctly." She waited. "Not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted to the requirements my position imposes, but because you are the most rigorous person I have encountered in my life, and you have managed more, with less acknowledgement, than any person I know, and I find that every problem that crosses my desk, I want to put in front of you first, not because you will solve it, but because you will look at it clearly, and I have been looking at things clearly alone for a long time, and I am done with it." He stopped. He looked at her with the evenness of a man who has finished preparing what he meant to say, and is now simply present with it. "I would like to build something with you. The estate. A life. I am asking you to consider it." Cordelia looked at the fire. She looked at the window. She looked at the estate plan on the desk, which was a good plan. She had contributed 3 annotations to it herself on the prior Wednesday, and she looked at him. She had survived 4 years of invisible labor. She had managed creditors and tenant disputes, and a contractual clause that had bound her without her consent, and a consortium of investors with fraudulent claims, and a social system that had not once paused to look at her directly. She had brought everything she had, and she had put it to work, and she had not become less than herself in the process. She looked at the Duke of Ashford, who had read her accounts in September, and come to find her in a corridor at 11:30, with the measuring attention of a man who had just identified something he needed to understand, and who had stood at her left in a crowded assembly room, without being asked, and who had had his solicitor review a rider to someone else's contract, because it was the obstacle in the way, and who was looking at her now, with the stillness of a man who is prepared to wait for an honest answer. She said, "Yes." Not immediately. After the full moment's pause, she gave to everything that required a careful answer, and then simply and directly, in the way she did everything. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He crossed to her and took her hand, not the gloved formal hold of the assembly room, but a bare, direct, unhurried hold, her fingers in his, and she let him, and they stood in the library in the January quiet, with the estate plan on the desk between them, like the beginning of a project they were both, finally, going to work on together. They were married in March, in the Ashford Parish Church, in a ceremony that was modest by ducal standards and well attended by everyone in the county regardless, because people will show up to see a thing that surprises them. Eleanor Braxton stood as witness with the particular brightness of a woman who has been waiting for something to be confirmed and is gratified to be right. Mrs. Dunmore attended from Amesworth, correct and composed, and found Cordelia in the vestry afterward and said, with the economy of a woman who does not waste words, "Well done," which was the warmest thing she had ever said, and Cordelia received it as it was given. Lord Basil Hargreave attended. He said nothing in particular to Cordelia, but he bowed to her in the churchyard with the correctness of a man who has revised his position and intends to hold to the revision. It was enough. What Cordelia built at Ashford in the years following was not what anyone had expected her to build, because no one had expected her to build anything, and that was entirely their failure of imagination. She revised the tenant agreements in the first 6 months, not simply for the Ashford estate, but in a format detailed enough that she was asked, by Sir Edmund Holt, to present the methodology to the Dartbridge Mercantile Society's annual meeting. She presented it. The framework was adopted by 7 neighboring estates in the following 18 months, each of which found, upon application, margins recovered that they had not known were missing. The wool contract renegotiation saved the estate £60 in the first year and 114 in the second, as volume grew. She established a household account system of sufficient clarity that it required, for the first time in the estate's recorded history, no correction at the annual audit. Ashford watched her work with the specific attention of a man who finds this the most interesting thing he has ever had the opportunity to witness. And when she looked up and found him watching, she said, "The first time it happened, you are going to get ink on your sleeve if you lean on that desk." And he had looked down, and she had been entirely correct, and he had smiled. Not a social smile, but the quiet, private one she had begun, in those early library evenings, to recognize as his most genuine expression, and moved. Their son was born in February of the following year, 11 months into the marriage. He was named Edward for her father, and the addition of William for Ashford's grandfather made it Edward William, which was a solid and serious name for a boy who arrived in the world with his mother's dark eyes and his father's unhurried gravity, and who was observed by both of them in his first week with the particular attention of people who have decided to see something clearly. The succession was secure, the estate was sound. There was more to do, and she knew exactly where to begin. On a Sunday morning in the March of his second year, when the mud had softened and the first suggestions of spring were audible in the trees beyond the library windows, Cordelia was working at the desk with the annual account summary spread before her when she heard small, unsteady boots in the corridor and the sound of Mrs. Graves, the nursemaid, making the gentle protest of someone who knows she will not win. Edward appeared in the doorway, escaped and triumphant, and made directly for the desk with the purpose of a very small person who has identified where the interesting things are kept. Ashford, who had been at the window with his coffee, reached him first, scooping him from the floor with the particular ease of a father who has been practicing, and settling him on his shoulder where Edward could see the desk from above, and reached for a pen with immediate professional interest. Cordelia rescued the pen. She looked at Ashford holding their son in the morning light, and Ashford looked back at her over Edward's head with the quiet, unhurried attention that she had come to understand as the most constant thing in her life, more constant than the accounts, more constant than the management problems that would continue to arrive and be answered, more constant than anything she had built or would yet build. She had been invisible for 4 years in a house she kept standing, and she had found, in a corridor at 11:30 with a candle guttering and line 47 uncorrected, a man who had come looking for exactly her. Not a version of her that fit more easily, not a corrected or elevated or repackaged version. The actual her, with her ledgers and her precise hand, and her gray wool, and her 400 pounds annually in recovered margin, and her certainty, held without apology, that she was not going to step aside for anyone. She returned the pen to the desk. She picked up her summary. Ashford was still watching her when she looked up, Edward half asleep on his shoulder, the morning coming through the windows in full, generous light, and she knew he was watching, and she let him, and she returned to the accounts. There was work to do, there always was, and she had, at last, the life in which to do it.